A rural road outside Tweed, Ontario, on a gray February morning, frost on the gravel, a school bus route, nothing moving. By that same afternoon, the Ontario Provincial Police had turned the stretch into a roadblock, stopping and photographing the tires of every vehicle that passed. 3 weeks earlier, a 38-year-old woman had been found dead in her own bed, a half-hour drive away. 11 days earlier, a 27-year-old woman had vanished overnight from a house she lived in alone. And pressed into the snow behind that house were two impressions no one could yet explain: a single boot print and one wide-tired tread. This is not a story about a stranger in the dark. It is a story about the man whose job was to keep an entire airbase and the prime ministers who passed through it safe. By the end, you will understand why the most decorated officer on that field left behind the one piece of evidence he could not photograph away. Just after 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night in late January 2010, a 27-year-old woman sent a text from the house she rented alone on Highway 37, south of Tweed. It was ordinary. Plans, a laugh, good night. She never sent another. Her name was Jessica Lloyd. She worked for a heavy equipment company, drove the same roads every day, and lived close enough to her mother that family checked in constantly. When she didn't appear for work that Friday, her brother drove out. Her car sat in the driveway. The doors were unlocked, her purse, her phone, her keys, all still inside. Jessica was not. There was no forced entry the first officers could read, no sign of struggle. The bed was made. A patio chair had been moved. Police would later fix her disappearance to a window of perhaps 6 hours overnight, on January 28th, a span in which a woman vanished from a locked-in life without a scream anyone heard. For investigators, the early problem was the absence of a story. No threats, no stalker on record, no motive anywhere. In the statistics of stranger abduction, that is the worst kind of case, because the very randomness that makes it terrifying is the same randomness that leaves nothing to trace. But the field behind her house was not empty. Someone had crossed it on foot. That was the first thread. To understand who walked across that field, you have to look 30 kilometers west, to the largest air transport base in the country. CFB Trenton is the hub through which soldiers, prime ministers, and the repatriated dead all pass. In July 2009, command of that base, roughly 3,000 personnel, was handed to a 46-year-old colonel with an immaculate record. He had piloted aircraft carrying the Queen and the Governor General. His reviews used words like superb and role model. His name was Russell Williams. Nothing in the public file suggested anything but a model officer. He owned a cottage in Tweed, the same small community where Jessica Lloyd lived, where a string of unsettling break-ins had gnawed at residents for 2 years. He jogged those rural roads. He knew them. And here is the structural fact this case turns on. The man with the highest security clearance on the base, the man whose signature could move a battalion, lived a parallel life no clearance had ever screened for. The military vets for loyalty, for competence, for the capacity to keep secrets. It does not, it turned out, vet for the kind of secret Williams was keeping. For now, in late January 2010, none of that was visible. The colonel was simply one of thousands of men in the region. What the OPEP did not yet know was that he had already killed once, and that the body had been found 2 months earlier, filed under a different theory entirely. Long before either murder, there was a pattern almost no one connected. Beginning around 2007, homes in Tweed and the Ottawa suburb of Orleans were being entered. Not robbed, not ransacked. Money was left untouched. What disappeared was underwear, lingerie, items taken from the bedrooms of women and girls. The intruder lingered for long stretches inside empty houses, and, this is what the courts later established, photographed himself wearing what he stole hundreds of times. On a camera, he cataloged with obsessive care. By the time the case closed, police tied 82 break-ins to one man. 82. Each a felony, each escalating in risk and intimacy. Criminologists who study paraphilic offending describe exactly this trajectory: voyeurism and fetish burglary functioning as rehearsal, the offender returning for greater proximity each time, until property crime is no longer enough. In September 2009, the break-in stopped being silent. Twice that month, in Tweed, the intruder entered homes while the women were inside, and assaulted them, blindfolded them, photographed them, then left them alive. The threshold had been crossed. Watching had become touching, and 2 months later, it would become killing. The first woman he killed wore the same uniform he did. Marie-France Comeau was 38, a corporal and a flight attendant on the military's VIP aircraft, the very fleet Williams commanded. She lived alone in Brighton, Ontario, a half-hour from the base. On the night of November 23, 2009, someone entered her home through a basement window. What happened over the following hours, the court record describes in terms too brutal to narrate in full. She was bound, assaulted, and suffocated. She fought hard. Evidence at trial showed she struggled enough that her attacker, at one point, told her he was trying not to hurt her, a lie preserved in his own photographs. Her body was found on November 25th by her partner. The death was treated immediately as a homicide, but the investigation that followed was anchored to her own world, a co-worker, an ex, someone with a reason. The idea that the base commander himself had climbed through her window did not exist as a hypothesis. Why would it? He had, in fact, signed off on the unit's condolences. He attended to its grief. In every ceremonial sense, the man overseeing the response to the killing of Marie-France Comeau was the killer. 2 months later, a short drive away, Jessica Lloyd disappeared. Only then did two investigations, built on opposite assumptions, begin to bend toward the same impossible answer. What linked the two cases was not, at first, forensics. It was geography and method. Both women lived alone in rural eastern Ontario. Both homes had been entered without obvious force. Both attacks involved binding, sexual violence, and a killer who lingered. As the OPEP's behavioral unit overlaid the Comeau homicide with the Lloyd disappearance, and with the cluster of break-ins and the 2 September assaults in Tweed, a single offender profile sharpened, organized, forensically aware, local, and almost certainly leading an outwardly conventional life. The profile of a man no neighbor would ever suspect. But a profile is not a name. By early February 2010, more than a week into Jessica Lloyd's disappearance, police had a behavioral sketch and nothing else. No body, no suspect, a community sliding into fear. They knew the offender drove. They knew he used these specific roads. So they did something deceptively simple. The kind of police work that wins no headlines and solves cases. They went back to the one place they were certain the killer had stood, the field behind Jessica Lloyd's house, and they read the ground. In the snow, they had a clean boot impression. Running near it, the tread of a tire, wide, distinctive, all-terrain. On its own, it was nearly useless. There are thousands of such tires in the county. Unless, of course, you could persuade every one of them to drive past you. The real mistake wasn't made in that field. It came 3 days later, when the colonel chose to drive home the ordinary way. By the first week of February, Tweed was a town holding its breath. 2 murdered women, a missing third, investigators now publicly linked the Comeau and Lloyd cases, and a population of a few thousand people locking doors they had never locked before. On February 4th, the OPP made a calculated bet. They set up a roadblock on Highway 37, the road that ran past Jessica Lloyd's house, and they stopped every vehicle. Officers weren't only asking questions. They were quietly comparing each truck and SUV that rolled through against what they had lifted from the snow, that wide, distinctive tread. It was a dragnet built around a single physical detail. Most drivers passed in seconds. Then, that night, a Nissan Pathfinder pulled up. The tires matched the impression behind Lloyd's home. The officer noted the plate and the driver and let him continue. Standard procedure, no arrest, nothing to alarm the man behind the wheel. The driver was Russell Williams. Within hours, investigators pulled his record and felt the floor shift. This was no drifter, no local with priors. This was the commanding officer of CFB Trenton, a man who had flown the Queen. Accusing him of anything would demand a certainty most prosecutors only dream of. They had a tire match. They needed the man himself to close the gap. So on February 7th, they asked Colonel Williams to come in for what was framed as a routine interview. He came. He was confident. He had, after all, never once been caught at anything in his life. The interview room at OPP headquarters in Ottawa was small and plain, and the man across the table was a detective sergeant named Jim Smith, a polygraph examiner and one of the force's most experienced interrogators. For the first hours, Williams did what trained, intelligent offenders do. He stayed calm. He was helpful, almost amused. the senior officer cooperating with juniors. Smith never raised his voice. He laid out the evidence slowly. The tire impression, the boot print, the footwear, and DNA comparisons already underway. And then he said the thing that breaks confident men. He told Williams, in effect, that the outcome was already decided, and that the only choice left was what kind of man he wanted to be in the record. The transcript of that interrogation, entered into evidence and since studied in criminology courses, captures the precise moment a fortress collapses. Williams asks how things are going to go. Smith tells him they are past the point of denial. There is a long, devastating silence, and then the colonel, the man who had outrun suspicion for years, says quietly that he wants to minimize the impact on his wife. It is the language of surrender. Over the next hours, he confessed to Comeau, to Lloyd, to the assaults, to the break-ins. But a confession is only words. Jessica Lloyd's family still did not know where she was. Where is she? Williams, almost helpfully now, pulled a sheet of paper toward him and began to draw a map. He drew a map, following Williams's own directions. On February 8, 2010, police walked into a wooded area off Cary Road north of Tweed and recovered the body of Jessica Lloyd. He had killed her after holding her captive and had moved her from where she died. 11 days after she stopped answering her phone, her family finally had her back, the cruelest possible version of an answer. In the days that followed, investigators executed search warrants on Williams's 2 homes, his vehicle, and his office. What they found rewired the entire case. This was not a man who had snapped. It was a man who had documented. They recovered tens of thousands of photographs and video files, organized with military precision, cataloging years of break-ins, the 2 assaults, and the murders themselves. He had kept the stolen lingerie. He had kept images of himself wearing it inside other people's bedrooms. He had, in effect, built the evidence that would convict him, and filed it like a logbook. For the forensic team, it was both windfall and horror. The trophies that fed his compulsion were the same trophies that made the prosecution airtight. There would be no case resting on the doubt of a single tire tread. There would be the offender's own meticulous archive, frame by dated frame, and that raised the question that still unsettles the people who worked this case. How does a man this careful, this controlled, leave a tread mark in the snow? The one thing he could not curate? Forensic psychiatry has a vocabulary for what Russell Williams was, even if it can never fully explain him. The progression in his case, voyeurism, fetish burglary, escalating to sexual assault, and finally to sexual homicide, maps onto what researchers call an escalating paraphilic trajectory. Decades of peer-reviewed work, much of it indexed in the forensic and psychiatric literature, has tracked offenders who begin with intrusive but non-contact behaviors and move, sometimes over years, toward lethal violence as each act fails to satisfy. The photographs were not incidental. For this category of offender, documentation is part of the compulsion, a way to relive and recontrol the act long after it is over. What makes Williams statistically rare is not the pathology, it is the camouflage. The overwhelming majority of organized sexual offenders are not pillars of an institution, not entrusted with thousands of lives. Williams maintained a marriage, a distinguished 23-year military career, and a parallel criminal life across the same calendar, in some cases the same week. Clinicians describe this as compartmentalization taken to a pathological extreme, the capacity to hold 2 utterly incompatible selves without apparent friction. And it forces an uncomfortable truth about detection. Every screening Williams ever passed, security clearances, command boards, fitness reviews, was designed to catch incompetence and disloyalty, not predation. By those metrics, he was exemplary. The system didn't fail to catch him. It was never built to. On October 18, 2010, in a packed courtroom in Belleville, Russell Williams did something most predators never do. He pleaded guilty to all 88 charges, 2 of sexual assault, 82 of breaking and entering. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, no spectacle of denial. What the courtroom heard instead, over 4 days, was the evidence read aloud and shown. Prosecutors presented Williams's own photographs and the recordings of his victims. Family members of Marie-France Comeau and Jessica Lloyd sat through it. Jessica's mother told the court she would never again sleep through a night. Journalists present called it among the most harrowing proceedings they had ever covered. On October 21st, The judge sentenced Williams to 2 concurrent life sentences with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum the law allowed. In a separate, almost ceremonial act of erasure, the Canadian forces moved to strip him of his rank and commission and ordered his uniform, his medals, and his service decorations destroyed. The institution moved to burn the very record of the career it had once celebrated. But sentencing closes a file. It does not close a wound. For the investigators, the prosecutors, and 2 grieving families, the central fact remained almost too large to hold. The man who did this had not hidden at the margins of society. He had stood at its center, in full dress uniform, and no one had seen it. In the months after the sentencing, the fallout spread far beyond one cell. The Canadian forces launched internal reviews into how a serving commander had operated undetected, and whether the bases he led should have caught warning signs. They found none in his file, which was, in its own way, the most disturbing finding of all. His residence on the base, the very home from which he sometimes drove to commit his crimes, was eventually demolished. The government also bought and tore down the Tweed cottage, unwilling to leave either standing. For the towns of Tweed and Brighton, the damage was quieter and longer. These were communities where people had genuinely never locked their doors. Investigators and residents described a sharp, lasting change in everyday behavior. Alarms, suspicion, the collapse of a belief that rural distance from the cities meant safety. The man who took that from them had been, on paper, the region's most trusted protector. And for the people who actually cracked the case, there was a hard professional lesson worth stating plainly. The break came not from the most sophisticated tool in the kit, but from the oldest instinct in policing. Go back to where you know the offender stood, and look at the ground. A behavioral profile narrowed the field. A community canvas and a roadblock applied the pressure, but it was a tire tread, read by a patient officer in the cold, that turned a colonel into a defendant, which is exactly the part of this story that still doesn't sit right. Here is what we know. A single low-tech detail, a tire tread pressed into February snow, undid a man who had spent years building a flawless forensic firewall around himself. Not DNA, not a cutting-edge lab, a pattern in the snow, and the patience to make him drive past it. Here is what we still don't fully understand. We don't know why the escalation took the exact path it did, or why it began when it did, in a man with everything to lose. We don't know how many break-ins were never reported, never counted. The 82 are only the ones police could prove, and we will likely never know whether some earlier, smaller signal, a complaint, a clearance review, a single uneasy colleague, could have interrupted the trajectory before Marie-France Comeau and Jessica Lloyd's names were attached to it. So here is the question worth arguing over. The system that screened Russell Williams was built to detect disloyalty and incompetence, and he was loyal and brilliant by every measure it used. Could any realistic screening have caught a man this compartmentalized before his first violent act? Or is the harder truth that some predators are invisible precisely because they excel at everything we use to measure trust? Tell me where you land in the comments, because that disagreement is the whole case. Marie-France Comeau was 38. Jessica Lloyd was 27. Whatever we conclude about the man who killed them, the record should lead with their names, not his.